test. The end of the test, I go up to her, I'm like, you got it? And she's like, still taping it. I know.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the annual Raymond C. Schmandt lecture. This was in honor of my predecessor, so I'm especially grateful that there was a place for me here. Today's speaker is Dr. Stefan Bensch, who is a professor of history at Swarthmore College, where he teaches medieval European and early, is that supposed to be early Islamic history? Early Islamic history. He is published on the social and economic history of medieval Barcelona, Jews, Byzantium, slavery, and interfaith relations in the Mediterranean. He is currently involved in research on the emergence of the nobility in the county of Empúries and their projection in the Catalan Mediterranean. If you would please silence your cell phones and then join me in giving Dr. Bensch a warm welcome.
Well, it's a great pleasure to return to St. Joseph's and have such a warm introduction and a nice audience. Today I'm going to be talking about a little-known facet of the Crusades. It's difficult to imagine a subject more popularly identified with the Middle Ages today than the Crusades. The very word itself stirs passionate responses among politicians and media figures, whose reactions range from presenting the crusading movement as a violent, oppressive predecessor of Western imperialism and colonization, to an inspiration for heroic self-sacrifice and purification. In the ostensibly cooler and more balanced judgments of many historians who have dealt with the subject, fill many bookcases with their investigations over the past 200 years, interpretations are hardly less wide-ranging. The subject was marginalized by medieval historians in the 19th and early 20th century, for they associated the First Crusade with feats of military daring-do in an exotic and ephemeral setting. For the core of the Crusader states in the Holy Land lasted less than a century and had little long-term impact on the Middle East. The events of the early Crusades therefore seem more appropriate for popular novels, political pamphleteering, and early cinema than serious scholarly investigation. To give you an example, I sent off my students last week to find some examples of this in contemporary culture, and of course, they did the right thing in their research. They Googled it. Here's what they found. Donald Trump as a Knight of St. John. And here, Donald Trump as a Crusader. The alt-right has tended to turn the Crusades into a kind of an anti-Muslim campaign led by Donald Trump. Again, a kind of recycling of an odd take on the Crusades. But again, it just keeps coming back in different forms. This attitude towards the Crusades as a scholarly subject has changed substantially in the past 2 generations. Crusading studies have greatly expanded their field of vision, spatially, temporally, institutionally, and ideologically. First of all, scholars of the Crusades no longer limit themselves to the period from the proclamation of the First Crusade to Jerusalem by Pope Urban II at Clermont-Ferrand in 1095 to the fall of Acre in 1291, the last vestige of the Crusader states. Recently, scholars have studied Crusades against Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, North Africans, Greek Orthodox Christians, heretics, schismatics, and political enemies of the papacy. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was in fact a full-bore crusade against enemies of the faith, namely the English under Queen Elizabeth, as was the Crusading League that kept the Ottoman Empire from conquering Vienna in 1683. Second, in addition to the vastly expanded chronological and geographical scope of crusading studies in the past generation, the material and institutional organization that sustained crusading over the centuries has received considerable attention. By 1300, every king, prince, lord, peasant, burgher, and clergyman in Latin Christendom had, in one way or another, been compelled to pay or collect taxes and tithes to finance crusading enterprises. And special religious orders had been founded to support crusading, the best known of which are the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights. The period from the fall of Acre in 1291 to the Hospitaller expedition to Rhodes in 1310, which was the first renewal of a crusade in the East after the fall of Acre, were the darkest days for crusading in the Middle Ages. The loss of Acre was a devastating and shocking blow to Latin Christendom. Here's the map of Acre, where you can see up here what is the Hospitaller house. Down here is the Templar house, and here are the Knights of the Teutonic Order. Today, the loss of Acre in 1291 is a convenient marker for the chronological division between the early Crusades and the later Crusades. Although the actual territory subject to Latin Knights of the Crusader states, which you can see here, oops, this was turned, so sorry. You'll have to think upside down. I'm not quite sure how to get it back here. Can I manage this? Too complicated. Yep, sorry. And anyway, think upside down. It's just the narrow band on the eastern Mediterranean. And Acre, I can't see it well from here, so sorry, is just above Haifa today. Although the actual territory, again, subject to the Crusader states, had in fact shrunk to some narrow coastal pockets around Antioch after Saladin had reconquered Jerusalem in 1187. The restoration of the entirety of the Crusader kingdoms and Jerusalem had still seemed a possibility in the 13th century. When news reached Rome that the last refuge for Latin Christians in the East was now lost, the papal curia became inundated with a series of treatises to reverse the situation. Although a general crusade would never again be launched to the Holy Land, proposals for renewing crusading in the East were churned out over the next 2 decades with a regularity reminiscent of policy papers from Washington think tanks. The disaster of 1291 left the military orders throughout the West dangerously vulnerable, for the princes and the faithful who had given them vast holdings throughout Europe over 2 centuries wondered whether the orders would use their resources to recover the Holy Land or simply devote themselves to administering their estates at home. The Hospitaller order feared that it would be dissolved, as happened to the Templar order in 1307. The military orders were essentially fighting monks, subject directly to the Pope to defend Christians against enemies of the faith, virtually forming states within states. The Knights of St. John, like the Templars and Teutonic Knights, grew from obscure beginnings in Jerusalem to aid Christian pilgrims before the First Crusade. Move on here to here we are, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The Knights Hospitaller first formed as lay brothers at the Benedictine monastery of St. Mary's near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, at the time the only Latin monastery in Jerusalem. They would receive a formal set of rules from the Pope around 1130 under the leadership of their first master, the Blessed Gerard, whose relic lies today in the Church of Santa Ursula in Malta. To point out another long-term transformation of crusading tradition, the order's devotion to the care of the sick would eventually lead to the creation of the world's first ambulance service, known as the Ambulance of the Knights of St. John in London, which would be a major force in the creation of the Red Cross in the 19th century. So you can here see the Maltese cross, or the Cross of St. John, and the Red Cross, which should be thought of together. Florence Nightingale was admitted into the ranks as an honorary member at the end of her life. In 12th century Jerusalem, however, the Hospitaller order quickly became imbued with the knightly crusading ethic, which led them, along with the Templars, to become the military bulwarks that propped up the crusading states. The greatest castle in the Holy Land was Crac de Chevalier, which was a Hospitaller castle. After the fall of Acre in 1291, however, both the very existence of the Knights Hospitaller and their support were called into question. After 1291, the military orders withdrew from Syria to an uneasy exile in Cyprus. The Hospitallers now not only needed to find a secure new home base for their order, but they also had to redefine their mission. The conquest of Rhodes provided a successful response to both challenges. Here we see an image of the great citadel of Rhodes that develops after the Hospitallers take control of it. Rhodes not only provided a secure base within easy striking distance of the Holy Land, but it also allowed them to develop a naval presence to interrupt prohibited Christian trade in war materials with Egypt. So here we see the transfer of the Grand Master of the Order of St. John, holding court in Rhodes, and here the galleys that would patrol the eastern Mediterranean. The Knights of St. John remained on Rhodes within a few miles of the Turkish coast until the Ottoman Navy finally drove them out and forced them to move again, this time to Malta in 1522, where they remained until Napoleon caused them to flee to Rome in 1798. So here's an image, again, with which the poster was made, which is actually of the siege of Malta by the Turks in 1322. We don't have any images of the arrival of the Hospitallers 200 years earlier in 1310. And here we see them where they are today in Rome, getting ready for a pilgrimage to Lourdes in their lovely black habits and the Cross of St. John on their chests. The story of the crusade to Rhodes was a critical turn in the long history of the Hospitallers and the crusading movement itself. It has been told many times, primarily from the bird's eye view provided by the archives of popes and kings. Today, I would like to include a perspective of these events based on a set of hitherto unknown documents from an unusual and, in many ways, unexpected source, the private archives of the Counts of Emporius, which are the oldest aristocratic archives in Europe. Emporius, I guess you can see it here more or less, is a county in the old Carolingian Spanish March. This is Catalonia up here, and this is the Costa Brava, where the French-Spanish border is on the Mediterranean. Two members of this baronial Catalan house, centered on the region of the Costa Brava, had a critical role to play in the crusade to Rhodes. The Count of Emporius himself, Ponce Hugues IV, provided substantial naval support for the conquest of Rhodes, and was involved in a simultaneous crusade against the Muslim kingdom of Granada in Spain. And his uncle, Ramon de Emporius, was the admiral of the Hospitaller Armada that completed the conquest of Rhodes in 1310. The actions of these two members of a powerful and independent Catalan baronial house, unknown until now, bring out a vital new dimension in the expedition to Rhodes, because they reveal the wider tensions at work in rebooting the Crusader ideal after the loss of the Holy Land. The deep involvement of this doggedly independent baronial house in two contemporaneous crusades at the far ends of the Mediterranean can only be understood through the renewed crusading enthusiasm promoted by Pope Clement V. Ascending the throne of St. Peter in 1305, Clement dedicated himself from the earliest days of his pontificate to taking direct action on the many treatises written to recover the Holy Land and to renew the crusading movement throughout the Latin Church. Adjusting to the practical difficulties of launching a direct and universal campaign to recover the Holy Land, the Passagium Generale, which was staunchly advocated by the Templar Order, Clement instead began to articulate the need for the Passagium Particulare, a series of tactically limited enterprises against enemies of the faith, as proposed by the Hospitaller Order, that would gradually clear the way for the general crusade to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land. The Pope rapidly enlisted allies for a broad range of limited crusading projects. One to come to the aid of the Armenian kingdom in southern Turkey in resisting the Turks. One to attack the Byzantine emperor, whom he excommunicated, and one to shore up crusading zeal in Cyprus by involving himself in local dynastic politics. Thus, Pope Clement promoted limited, regionally focused crusading projects, the Passagium Particulare, in part through the interdiction of Christian trade with the Middle East in an incipient form of economic warfare, in order to soften up Muslim powers in the East before a full-scale crusade to the Holy Land could be launched. Latin monarchs, especially Jaume II, King of Aragon, as well as the Hospitaller Order, were both deeply affected by this reshaping of crusading goals. Because of the presence of an Iberian Muslim frontier, the military orders in the crown of Aragon, the Mediterranean littoral of Iberia, which I hope you can see well there. So this is the old core of the crown of Aragon, here with Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia, as well as at this time Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, southern Naples, and Athens, all of which are subject to the King of Aragon. The king, again, found it difficult to support both a crusade against Granada, here, which is still a Muslim kingdom in Europe, and again in the East at the same time. Relatively few Knights Hospitaller from the crown of Aragon ever served in the East, despite the order's many houses and wealth in Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia. Although the King of Aragon had actually supported earlier crusading projects organized by the popes, even earning him the title of Admiral of the Papal Fleet, he at various times threatened to confiscate Hospitaller properties in his territories if they did not devote the order's resources to expanding his Iberian realms by attacking the Kingdom of Granada. He even prohibited the order from sending knights or materials from his territories to the east. Thus, the Muslim-Christian frontier in Iberia provided a competing goal for crusading, drawing away resources from plans to recover the Holy Land. In Aragon and Castile, new plans emerged to complete the Reconquista in Iberia, which had been in abeyance for 60 years. A new crusade was proclaimed against the Kingdom of Granada in 1309 and 10, but it originated not at the curia of Pope Clement V, who was lukewarm about it, but in an alliance between Iberian kings. In the Treaty of Alcalá de Henares in March 1308, Jaume II of Aragon and Fernando IV of Castile agreed on a joint campaign to conquer the Kingdom of Granada, once and for all, and divide it among themselves. In a coordinated land and naval assault, Fernando was to undertake the siege of Algeciras, which is near the Straits or the Rock of Gibraltar, while Jaume attacked the port of Almeria, just to the east. Both keys to controlling the straits. Each monarch was to supply 10 galleys with supporting vessels in order to protect the land forces and block any Muslim reinforcements from North Africa. While originating in a royal alliance, both kings appealed to Clement V for support. In early 1309, the Pope transformed the proposed expedition into a crusade by granting plenary indulgences equivalent to those for a crusade to the Holy Land. In fact, the first crusading bulls issued for Iberia in almost a century. In order to gain support for undertaking a campaign to Almeria, King Jaume II of Aragon sent out a summons to the leading barons of his realm in February 1309 to attend a general council the following month at Tortosa, which is up here on the Ebro, right up there below Barcelona. Although the council was deferred, an inauspicious beginning to the enterprise, the original summons included Count Pons-Hug IV, Count of Empúries, one of the 17 Catalan barons involved. In the opening decade of the 14th century, Pons-Hug had a very tense relationship with the king, who was beginning to exert with growing arrogance his claims of sovereignty over the county, one of the last two counties preserving their independence in Catalonia. The Counts of Empúries had a lineage they considered as old and prestigious as that of the kings of Aragon. They continued to conduct their own foreign diplomacy, mint their own coins, and exert their rights over their Jews, to the growing irritation of the king, to whom they were nominally subject. They had even recently diverted the lower reaches of the River Ter along their border from the royal domain to their own territory. The Count of Empúries, however, was absent at the beginning of the siege of Almeria in the summer of 1309. He judged it more critical to sail to Sicily in order to negotiate the marriage of his eldest son to the daughter of the King of Sicily, in large part to pursue a Mediterranean policy independent from that of King Jaume. When the Count returned to Empúries in the fall of 1309, he sent a congratulatory letter to the king for his initial successes in the campaign against Granada. He then took a crusading vow and made his testament in late October in preparation for departing for Almeria. But by the time he began to marshal his knights to join the venture, the initiative had passed to the Muslim defenders. Even though the King of Aragon was now withdrawing his knights and troops from the south, he nevertheless commissioned the Count of Empúries to captain a squadron of 5 galleys, outfitted at royal expense, to patrol the straits between Morocco and Andalusia in February 1310. This was a significant force, expensive to maintain. 3 of the galleys were outfitted at Barcelona through a loan of 16,000 solidi from the Bishop of Barcelona, and 2 at Valencia from a loan of 10,000 solidis of caca from the Bishop of Saragossa. During the crusade to the Kingdom of Granada, the final stage in the hospitaller conquest of Rhodes was unfolding. Plans for a hospitaller crusade to Rhodes materialized slowly in the summer of 1308, the same year as the Granadan expedition was being organized. Like the campaign to Algeciras and Almeria, the elevation of the naval armada to Rhodes to a crusading expedition occurred at a secondary stage of the military operations. At first, neither the King of Aragon nor Ramon de Empúries the Count of Emporius's uncle, had any involvement in the project. In late 1306, Pope Clement V summoned the Master of the Templars, Jacques de Moret, and Fouque de Villaret, Grand Master of the Hospitallers, to Poitiers to formulate plans for future crusades and determine the place of the military orders in them. While the Master of the Temple advocated organizing a general crusade to the Holy Land, his Hospitaller counterpart urged a series of more limited preparatory crusades, particularly one to aid his order in establishing a secure, independent home in Rhodes, so that it could serve as a useful place to block maritime trade with Muslims and as a staging point for future crusades on Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. By the end of the year, Fouque's counsel had been heeded, for the Pope formally granted the island of Rhodes to the Hospitallers in September 1307, and in March 1308 issued a bull for a passagium particulare, a regional crusade under Hospitaller command, but without an explicit objective. Yet the Hospitaller convent in Cyprus, again, where they first moved, just to reinforce that, and here is Rhodes, that the Hospital convent in Cyprus had already acted on its own while Fouque de Villaret was meeting with the Pope in Poitiers. A small fleet, principally Genoese, had been established in Cyprus in October 1306 and succeeded in occupying most of the island, although the Greek population, possibly with Turkish help, managed to hold out in the city of Rhodes. The situation on the island at the time of the Hospitaller conquest was chaotic. Although nominally subject to the Byzantine emperor, the Greek population of the island, decimated by generations of razzias by Genoese, Venetian, and Turkish galleys, was under the loose supervision of a Genoese entrepreneur and pirate, Vignolo dei Vignoli. Although another Genoese faction on the island, led by Andrea Moresco and his brother Leonardo, cousins of Vignolo, seem to have been undermining his authority with the Byzantine emperor. To complicate matters further, Venetians claimed the overlordship of the nearby island of Kos, and Turkish pirates, no doubt connected to factions in the emirate of Meshede on the mainland, only 12 miles away, had used Rhodes as a base to capture Christian ships off its shores in 1303. Genoese lords on the island also regularly employed Turkish soldiers as auxiliaries. The insecure and vacillating loyalties on the island did not facilitate an easy conquest, and it is unclear how secure the initial Hospitaller occupation of the island was without the surrender of the city of Rhodes itself. The crusading armada, consisting of 26 galleys and other supporting ships, set out from Genoa in October 1309, but had to delay at Brindisi in Apulia in January 1310. So it's formed up here in Genoa and sailed down until it had to stop here and winter there because of bad weather and supply difficulties. Its true goal was not to expel Turks from the island, but to consolidate the Hospitallers' position on Rhodes by dispensing with local Genoese leaders and relying exclusively on the order's knights, who quickly turned Rhodes into the fortress command center for the entire order. Within a few years of the crusade, the piratical Genoese opportunists were no longer on the scene. Andrea Moresco disappeared, his brother Lodovico was languishing in a Cretan prison, and their uncle and rival, Vignolo dei Vignoli, was last heard of being captured and imprisoned by his fellow citizens. The proclamation of a Hospitaller crusade with ambiguous objectives announced by Clement V in 1308 became primarily an opportunity to justify the continued relevance of the order and to consolidate its position over insecure allies in what will become its new island fortress. The promotion of both the crusade against Granada and the Hospitaller Crusade in Rhodes must also be set against the background of the dissolution of the Templar order. In December 1307, King Philip the Fair of France arrested the leading Templars in his kingdom and seized their property. In March 1308, the King of Aragon followed suit, and Clement IV formally dissolved the order in 1312. The Hospitallers were clearly looking over their shoulder as they were sailing off to subjugate Rhodes. In order to justify their continued existence, the Grand Master of the order induced Pope Clement to endow their expedition with crusading bulls and indulgences, which they hoped would protect them from the same fate as the Templars. The Aragonese monarch had always envied the independence of the military orders in his realms and coveted their resources. When preparing for the siege of Almeria in 1308, King Jaume II asked Pope Clement V for either all the tithes owed the Hospitallers in his lands, or their responsiones, that is, the third of the revenues they collected, which were to go to the Grand Master of the order for crusading in the East. The king wanted to use these for his crusade against Granada. The Pope refused. Not surprisingly, the King of Aragon deeply distrusted the Hospitaller Crusade, which he cynically remarked in one letter served only to advance the order's control of their new base in Rhodes, but had nothing whatsoever to do with the recovery of the Holy Land. The king's suspicion had led him a year earlier to order the royal vicar, the royal official in Barcelona, Bertran de Llaura, to track down discreetly and without arousing attention, caute et secrete, a certain youth named Joannet. The letter described him as 20 years old, ruddy in complexion, with a pleasing appearance, and a hospitaller who was about to ship out to Rhodes. The suspect, the vicar was informed, customarily stayed at the house of Raimonet de Torre, nephew of the Castellan of Amposta, the head of the Order of Hospitallers in the Crown of Aragon. King Jaume II was trying on the sly to acquire more information about the Hospitallers' secret plans in order to develop a strategy to undermine them. Given that the king had begun to arrest individual Templars and confiscate their lands in his realm in the spring of 1308, and was increasingly suspicious of the Knights of St. John, it is perhaps not surprising that the only known support of the Hospitaller Crusade to Rhodes in the Crown of Aragon came from the comital dynasty of Empúries, always eager to keep the king at a distance. At the time, Ramon de Empúries, uncle of the count, was serving as the interim Castellan of Amposta, the center of the Hospitaller order in the Crown of Aragon. Fouque de Villaret, Grand Master of the order, secured the support of the comital family by appointing Ramon de Empúries Admiral of the Hospitaller Armada destined to Rhodes, and received substantial support from the Count of Empúries himself to make the venture a success. Of the 26 galleys assembled for the crusade at Brindisi in January 1310, 4 were supplied by Count Pons Hugues IV, and another came from the Aragonese Hospitallers. During that summer, Ramon de Empúries recognized receiving personally at Rhodes from his brother, the Count, substantial amounts of merchandise and loans to support the crusade. In the standards of Cyprus, 1 quintal and 30 rolls of black wax, 77.5 rolls of pepper, 1 quintal and 30 rolls of linen from Alexandria, 450 quintals and 400 rolls of butter blended with honey, 500 striped cloths from Barbary, 620 pelts, and 78 Saracen slaves, both male and female, valued at 12 florins each, as well as 4,354 gold florins, 390 gold doblas, and 2,500 solidi of Barcelona. It had been a profitable summer on the high seas for the Count of Empúries. The letter of debt made it clear that the Count, on his own initiative, had taken the squadron of 5 galleys assigned him by the King of Aragon to patrol the Straits of Gibraltar, and led them personally into the rich commercial sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean in support of the Hospitaller Crusade. After taking the cross, the Count had simply switched crusades, abandoning the crusade against Granada with his ships to join the crusade to Rhodes. This shift gave him license to capture any Christian ships, in this case, a galley from Venice stuffed with Eastern merchandise, trading with Egypt. It would take many years, much litigation, and innumerable diplomatic exchanges to determine whether such a large haul of goods and monies captured from the Venetians was the work of a brave and selfless crusader, faithfully interdicting prohibited trade between Christians and Muslims, as the Count of Empúries, the Pope, and the Order of St. John maintained, or the depraved acts of a ruthless and piratical marauder, as the King of Aragon and the merchants of Venice, his victims, argued. In June of 1310, the Grand Master of the Hospitaller Order, Fulk de Villaret, sent a heartfelt message, one of the very few original parchments from his Majesty to survive, to Count Ponce Hugues IV and his genus, his entire family, thanking them for their generous support and offering them prayers from the entire order. Part of the devotion of Grand Master Fulk de Villaret derived from the favored status the Counts of Empúries had shown the Hospitallers. When Ponce Hugues IV was preparing to set off for the crusade in Almeria the previous fall, he made his testament. At that time, only a single male heir remained to him, Maugali, who, his father insisted, should now be called Ponce Hugues V, rather than by his unusual surname. Although the Count of Empúries had just arranged the marriage of Maugali to the daughter of King Frederick III of Sicily, in the hope of expanding his own Mediterranean influence and reinforcing the independence of his county from the intensifying aggrandizements of the King of Aragon, the Count had by then been ruling his lands for 47 years, and the end of his days must have seemed in sight. A deep concern of dying without legitimate heir was apparent in his testament, which went into considerable detail about succession. If Maugali died heirless, the Count's possessions should pass to a kinsman, Ramon Folc, Viscount of Cardona, the most powerful baron in Catalonia. If Ramon Folc died heirless, however, then all the Count's properties and rights were to pass to the Hospitaller Order itself, under condition that the order transfer its central commandery in the Crown of Aragon from the castle of Amposta, its traditional center for 200 years, to the Count's newly constructed capital in the south of his county, Belcaira de l'Empordà, and that the head of the Aragonese Hospitallers change his title from the Castellan of Amposta to the Castellan of Empúries. When Maugali, in fact, did die without a male heir in 1322, a protracted struggle for control of the county among the Hospitallers, Ramon de Empúries, Ramon Folc de Cardona, the Pope, and the King of Aragon ensued. Only after many years of acrimonious conflict and litigation did the county finally pass as a loose appanage to the Aragonese monarchy in 1325. This part of the story has gone unnoticed in the many histories devoted to the Order of St. John. To this point, no source in the royal archives of the Crown of Aragon, the archives of the Order of St. John, or the Vatican Library has been discovered which identifies Brother Ramon de Empúries as the admiral of the Hospitaller Crusade to Rhodes. It is worth pausing over this silence. The memory of Ramon de Empúries may well have been suppressed by the Order of St. John itself. Because of the huge debts and bitter litigation incurred by the admiral of the fleet and the Aragonese Hospitallers as a consequence of the crusade to Rhodes, Ramon de Empúries was expelled from the order in 1314. He resisted by force. A virtual civil war ensued among the Aragonese Hospitallers until the new Castellan of Amposta laid siege to the castles still loyal to the ex-admiral of the crusade and forced him to yield. Even more threatening, King Jaume II of Aragon initiated legal proceedings against the House of Empúries in pursuing a vicious sexual politics against his rivals, related no doubt to the charges of sexual and moral turpitude brought against the Templars after their arrest in 1307 in France, and in the following year in Aragon. The king charged Count Ponce IV with sodomy in order to deprive him of this county and attach it to the crown. Although the count successfully defended himself, the testimony collected provides the most extensive trial record for a sodomy prosecution in the Middle Ages. Less known, however, are the charges the king brought against Ramon de Empúries, Castellan of Amposta, after the crusade to Rhodes, in all likelihood in connection to his expulsion from the order. Among other crimes, Ramon was charged with keeping a Jewish mistress in Girona, of having another mistress, this time a Muslim slave in Tarragona, whose rival lover he murdered, and of killing 2 young Hospitaller pages serving him personally during the crusade to Rhodes. Although we do not know the actual outcome of the trial, it nevertheless could not have served to enhance Ramon's reputation. The aggressive deployment of allegations of sexual deviance for blatantly political ends emerged with great virulence on several fronts just at the moment when crusading was being revived and adapted to new ends, and the military orders were being reorganized. The most infamous case is, of course, related to the suppression of the Templar order from 1307 to 1312. The moral and sexual cause célèbre of the late Middle Ages. In addition to allegations that they performed a bizarre rite of initiation that involved denying Christ, spitting on the crucifix, worshiping the head of idols, and disrobing during the ceremony to perform sexual acts on one another, the royal judges of France and Aragon, as well as the church's inquisitors, asserted that the Templars allegedly encouraged and demanded all their members to practice sodomy. This led to the master of the order, Jacques de Molay, and other leading Templars to be burned at the stake. The charge here of sexual deviance and moral heresy and moral turpitude, if you will, has been undermined by modern scholarship. But still, it had very real consequences. To give you an example of what kind of devil worship or idol worship may be going on, this is the head of St. John the Baptist from a Templar house in Theobridge, England, which again was moved when the order was disbanded in 1308. This may be the kind of idol worship that the Templars were being charged with. But the consequences were very real. Here is a depiction from a royal manuscript in Paris showing that Molay and his cohorts were burned at the stake because of these charges. The charge of sexual deviance against the Templars has usually been treated as part of a growing intolerance toward homosexuality in the later Middle Ages, but it has rarely been connected to allegations of hyper-virility and the transgression of sexual boundaries, such as those leveled against Ramon de Empúries just at this time. To understand this connection and the explosion of the rhetoric of sexual scandal appearing around the Crusading revival and the expedition to Rhodes, it is useful to note that in the late 13th century and early 14th, the regulation of sexuality was no longer reserved to canon law and the confessional. For the first time, penalties for sexual misconduct were being included in ordinances promulgated by kings, princes, and town councils, and that the prosecution of sexual infractions would be subject to lay as well as ecclesiastical courts. These laws include not only penalties for sodomy, which has attracted the most attention in recent scholarship, but also heterosexual contact with Jews and between Jews and Muslims and Christians, as well as rape. The many treatises about the recovery of the Holy Land constantly reiterate the harm caused by political disunity and dissension among Christian leaders and the need for moral purity. Though charges of heresy and moral perversions, persecutors of the Templars could lay at their door the cause for the fall of Acre in 1291 and the loss of the Holy Land to the Catholic Church. What is important here is not actual sexual behavior, always difficult to determine, but the virulence of the rhetoric of sexual scandal, which I suggest is connected to a new type of purification needed to renew crusading and allow Christian knights once again to recover Jerusalem for the Latin Church. This dimension of crusading discourse has, I feel, been overlooked. The charges of sexual deviance brought by the King of Aragon against two members of the baronial house of Empúries have been largely ignored, and their connection to the Hospitaller Crusade to Rhodes are only found in hitherto unknown documents buried in an obscure aristocratic archive. A sexual cover-up, perhaps? Only an enlarged vision of crusading history allows the significance of the crusade to Rhodes to come to light. Instead of emerging as a crusading hero, the admiral of the Armada, Ramon de Empúries, in reality, the savior of the Order of St. John, has until now left no trace in the memory of the order itself, nor in any modern works devoted to the Crusades. This critical moment in crusading history and in the history of the Hospital Order has, one might say, been buried beneath the bed sheets of the barons. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you take some questions from the floor?
I'd love to.
Floor is open.
Sexual scandal, always a popular topic. Absolutely. How many of you really know who the Order of St. John is? Anyone? Kind of, yeah. What do you know about it? What does it devote to? Yeah. Oh, just heard. It has the cool Maltese cross. Because Malta becomes, which again, succeeds Rhodes as the head of the order, saves Christendom from being Ottoman, right? They're defending Malta against the Ottoman fleet in 1517, just before the Battle of Lepanto, when Don Juan of Austria, who is an heir of the King of Aragon, turns back the Ottoman fleet, and soon again the It prevents large parts of the Mediterranean, including Italy and Spain, from being subject to the Ottomans. So again, this is really the bulwark of the order, which in some ways goes a way back here to explain this image. Again, one of the alt-right's favorites. Donald Trump as a Knight of St. John.
I have a question about the properties of the hospitals, because you mentioned the church in England, and I know that all the crusading orders had generous donations all throughout Europe from which they drew revenue. Did the hospitalers ever lose their holdings?
No, they more or less gained the Templars' holdings. It was all folded in together right at this time. But there are, again, variations on this. It's not, and it's a great debate who actually controlled the property, because the Pope wanted to take control, naturally, as the head of the order. But the kings wanted it too, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of infighting over the material foundations of the Crusades. And in this part of Spain, they're probably the largest landowners that exist. It's not the counts and the lords, it's the hospitalers and the Templars, who were given huge pieces of land and castles to pursue crusading against the Muslims in Spain. And the general rule is, again, that the Templar properties went to the hospitalers, but an exception in the Crown of Aragon, whose king was very suspicious of the independence of the military orders and a state within a state, if you will. The Hospitaller and Templar orders in the Kingdom of Valencia in eastern Spain were turned in, I think it's 1313, into the Order of Montesa. So there's another crusading order, if you will. So it varies, but as a general rule, the Hospitallers and Templars, the largest of the crusading orders in the Mediterranean, were folded together and had even more land. So this is why the Hospitallers survive and become one of the bulwarks of Spain and are there on the ships on crusade to defeat Elizabeth I of England, that enemy of the faith.
So I'll go ahead and ask a question so our students see that you won't bite. Hopefully, student-wise, I'll leave it to my students in my witchcraft class to ask about the connections between the sexual accusations you laid out and the things that we've seen witches accused of, because they are strikingly similar.
Absolutely.
What I wanted to ask about was a point in your talk where you were mentioning skepticism about the actual motivations for going to Rhodes. And that brought up a lot of parallels to research that I do on alliances in the 16th century, and the potential for manipulating crusading language to achieve goals that one has outside of crusading but can achieve under the guise of crusading. So how much in this time period, end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th with the revival, how much of this manipulation of language can you identify in the sources, and how much of this is driven by actual crusading fervor to go defeat the heathen?
Right. Whatever the crusade is exactly here, this is the part of the question. No, it's all interconnected, and again, because as you know, there's a kind of purification that goes along with crusading. Since crusading indulgences are a penitential act. An interesting spin on this, just to remind students of this, is that technically Templars and Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights and the other military orders can never technically take up the crusading cross because it's their day job. They cannot have a crusading indulgence because they're double dipping in salvation. They only get it through their regular job as a Templar or a Hospitaller. But this whole language is, again, connected to purity, and I think there's an explosion of language about purification that's taking on a very sexualized form right at this moment, in this 3 or 4 year period. Just as we are changing our discourse about sexual harassment, just like that. I mean, this is a different discourse than it was 2 years ago, and I think will never be the same. I think this is something very similar, and has gone sort of unnoticed because there's been such an emphasis only on the history of homosexuality itself, rather than these other charges of sexual scandal that are heterosexual, but it's all in the same bag, and often it's connected with heresy. So and there's suspicions of Judaizing, and everything bad gets rolled up in the othering of this group, but the language just, I think, changes in a flash. I wish I could answer more specifically the development of this language and where one finds it. What I haven't done is gone through more than 20 crusading treatises written after the fall of Acre in the next 15 years. They're just everywhere. So once the Holy Land falls, the early crusading is done, everybody's got an idea, sort of. They talk about it in these grandiose terms. I said, I think it's the beginning of economic warfare through blocking trade, which in a little episode, that's what that seized Venetian galley was all about, which the Count says, well, I'm a crusader, I have a right to do this. And the Venetians say, no, no, you're on the wrong crusade, you're a pirate. Is he a pirate or a crusader? Well, jury's out, 50-50. It's very close. So this language is just intensifying, and one of the interesting parts about it are these treatises are thinking globally in a very new way. It's not just about Christian inspiration, it's about how to weaken the Mamluk regime in Egypt by interdicting certain products, charging extra taxes on any Christian found, doing business with them, shipping arms, or shipping them slaves. And remember, Mamluks are slaves, and it's the Genoese who are providing them to the Muslims to fight crusaders. Nasty business. But money talks, as we know. It's true.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. It's really just business. The idea, I guess I was wondering about the whole movement to Rhodes for the Catalonia and Barcelona's control, if you will, or keep their hand in the Mediterranean trade, because the Genoese and the Venetians had so much of it tied up. And
exactly. I
was wondering how much they were actually, Catalonia was being marginalized here with respect to that, a way to keep their hand in. Is that what, I mean, that, I think what you said was interesting. I was wondering if there's more of that, but that was actually going on that we never hear about.
Absolutely. Well, this is something I write about, because I like, I'm very involved with Barcelona. Let's go back to that map of Crown of Aragon. If I can find it here quickly. There. Barcelona is kind of a late bloomer in comparison to Genoa and Venice. So they get into the Byzantine world in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean a little bit later, really with the 1260s, when they get really involved in southern Italy and Sicily. Remember the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, in which essentially the crown of France, the Angevins, has control through the son of St. Louis of Sicily, who's king of Sicily and Naples. But there's a revolt, and the Sicilians invite the King of Aragon to come because he married the German Emperor Friedrich II's daughter and inherited the anti-papal claims in Italy, the Ghibelline claims.
That's how it goes from Schmandt to the Aragon.
Exactly. And what follows is what's now been called a 200-year war between the Crown of Aragon and the House of Anjou in the Mediterranean to see who would win. Again, we think of this as the kind of Spanish part, but it's really the Catalan part, right? Which is very different than Castile.
Right. That's right.
And you can see over here, even on this sketchy map, that by 1310, Catalans had control of Athens and are serving as troops for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who first hires them to fend off the Turks. But then the Catalans start behaving badly, and he turns against them, and they invite the Turks to enter Europe. It's through the Catalans that the Turks first cross the Bosphorus and Dardanelles through Catalan support. So this whole map is getting really messy in the late Middle Ages, and again, this becomes the kind of overlay of different peoples here in the Eastern Mediterranean, which we're still dealing with. Interestingly, when I was in Rhodes last summer, the Hospitaller Street, the great medieval street, was having a wonderful conference hosted by the UN High Commission on Refugees, because most of the Syrian refugees leave Syria and go to Rhodes first. That's how they get into the EU, is through Rhodes. And once you're in, you're in. So there were lots of Syrian refugees that are being cared for in Rhodes, just as they were caring for the military orders having to flee in the 14th century.
There are no more questions?
One more.
Oh, sorry, I was hoping for a student, but I will. I was really interested in. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I was interested in the trials that you were talking about, and you were saying that sometimes you don't know the outcome of the trials, and just saying a little bit more about the records that are left, and where you find these records, and what you're seeing in those.
Yeah, actually, the two trial records that I mentioned have been kind of known, but it's kind of an embarrassment for the Catalans. In an earlier generation, you didn't want to talk about these things. Now, of course, we love them, right? Things have changed in the early 21st century. The records are really what a trial recorder would put down in a US courtroom. So you hear all the witnesses, it's written down. The trial record against the count runs to something like, I don't know, it's about 120 pages. So everyone at the court was asked, well, what do you know? What did the count do when he left with this page? What? So you really get into the nitty-gritty of court behavior. What we don't know is the outcome, because that would be the judge's decision, which is filed somewhere else and doesn't survive. But the count continues to rule until his death, so one assumes it didn't go anywhere. And Ramon de Empúries himself is later reinstated and becomes the head of the Catalan Hospitallers again. So his reputation is restored, although he's accused of keeping mistresses everywhere, and even though he's a monk and cavorting everywhere he can, but that's kind of all right in the Middle Ages. That's not what people are worried about so much. So, and interestingly, that trial record is published around 1900 by this kind of quirky Catalan, what should I say, not a scholar, he didn't have a university position, but a kind of local erudite, one would say in Catalan, a kind of learned person, because nobody got a job in history. It wasn't a university position in 1900 in Barcelona. So he's kind of from the learned elites. And he published a book about various kinds of medieval sexual scandal, where he just published the records, entitled Todos los ojos tienen bec, all ducks have beaks, which is a Catalan proverb meaning, well, it's just all the same. So the idea that people were fooling around all the time. Okay, fair enough. But as we know with our own interest in gender, the discourse can suddenly shift. And I think that's what's happening. This has really gone unnoticed, but there is this almost, how should I say, a panic, a kind of sexualized panic that's going on in the discussions at this moment. Just, and maybe we're more sensitive to it because of the shifting discourse in the last year that we've seen in the United States. I mean, it really does change on a dime sometimes. Whatever the reality of the conduct is, it's the discourse. And suddenly it just explodes into sexual perversions, heresy, all kinds of things, and then kind of disappears again. So there is this kind of strange, kind of sexual panic almost in the discourse that goes on.
I was going to ask you again, because you had said at the time, and you mentioned something about the rise of secular law. So that, like in the Middle East, when it's moving from Sharia to secular law, certain things still stay under Sharia or personal status, which is things such as marriage, women, you know, the more cultural, sexual aspects of things. And I was just wondering if possibly because the church is being challenged with secular law, that certain areas they wanted to show that they still had control over, or I don't know. I just thought it was kind of interesting. It looks like almost the same where, you know, so you have this one side of it, certain things go under secular law, and it takes a while for all the other stuff to go under secular law, and it's still in the realm of this kind of religious law and control. And
Yeah, it's true, but yet at the same time, the kind of confessional law of the church is still very much in play. And we have very similar things from Inquisition records, which often talk about sex, right? Because it's considered to be another kind of perversion like heresy, and they're usually interconnected. Although in comparison to 100 years earlier, when the great danger was Catharism, it was good for people to have sex. The church wants them because the Cathars denied the flesh, and that Christ had a body, for instance, so, and denied marriage and all this kind of thing. And procreation was all bad because it perpetuated the flesh rather than the spirit. So it was good for the church to find people having sex, even if it was illicit. It's a sign you weren't a heretic. But now it is. So the discourse kind of shifts in this period. And we have lots of records of inquisitorial trials, including of the Templars. So the church is still tracking this down, but so too now are secular courts, and secular penalties like the confiscation of your county, which the king likes, can be pursued. But this was so blatantly political, whatever the reality of the conduct was, that it just didn't go through somehow.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm sure if you wanted to ask a question privately, you could come up and talk with Dr. Bensch. And please help yourselves to refreshments on the way out. Let's thank Dr. Bensch.